The hard part about real movement and movement building is that it does require real relationships, the kind of relationships where, you can get on the phone with someone or look them in the eye and talk about what it is that we want and what we hope for and how we build that.
We are in the middle of a pandemic. There's a lot of challenges, but in many ways, it just exposed the weaknesses within the system we already have. My feature conversation is with Abdul El-Sayed. His views on politics, health, and our nation are a fresh take on what the potential of this country could be. Agree or disagree with him, I think you're going to want to hear and listen to what Abdul has to say. There's a reason this former head of the Detroit Health Department, gubernatorial candidate, and now author has been getting national attention on CNN and a ton of other places. Abdul is out with a new book, Healing Politics, a doctor's journey into the heart of our political epidemic. After that, I'll update you on a few things to know around town. This is your Daily Detroit for Thursday, August 6, 2020. I'm J.R. Stays, and let's get started. Doctor, political epidemic is very appropriate, especially that word epidemic right now.
That's right. When I wrote this book, I took a lot of care to explain the science of epidemiology. It turns out that I'd be publishing it in the middle of a pandemic when it seems that most people on Twitter are armchair epidemiologists now. So there's that.
Well, and that's the whole thing. There is so much stuff in this conversation, which strikes me as, shouldn't we have had these conversations in middle school science class?
One of the real challenges that this moment is bringing up is the fact that we as a society have not done a great job really talking about and teaching about science. And, in a moment right now where we're in real time trying to explain an epidemic that is flowing amongst us, folks don't appreciate that, science is a process. It's not a body of knowledge. And so what science tells us we ought to be doing to prevent transmission and death to this pandemic, it changes as we learn more and study more about a coronavirus that's only really been in humanity for 7 months now. And so you're right. We really do need to do a better job of teaching science generally, but also specifically teaching epidemiology so folks understand how this works, how we think about it, and what's coming. Because, of course, in a moment where it's our collective behavior that is going to shape whether or not this spreads and how it spreads and whom it spreads and ultimately who it kills. This is critical knowledge.
One of the themes, speaking of collective behavior, that I noticed reading this book was there's just various points where it's almost as if you call for a change in some collective behavior. Like one of the stories that kind of stuck out for me, I live in the North End, and you talk specifically about an example in the North End where you had your gray Ford Focus, you went to an event, and it was the most modest car in the lot, and you got the advice from someone that you needed to, level up or something along those lines. And yet I think to myself in those situations, what about the priorities? Is the priority about the car and like showing off? Or is it about, to me, like, okay, well, that's more money for your family and allows you to have more financial flexibility. Although I will admit, great beats are important in any car.
Well, the story you talk about happened in the North End at a community event. And I was really surprised because, we were talking the entire time about basic home affordability and quality of jobs and the kind of policies we needed to uproot poverty. And one of the points that I make with that story, though, is that, there is a natural need to keep up with the Joneses, right? Even if you can't afford a basic set of things, there's something about being able to have a couple of nice things and also feeling like you want to show that, you're not somebody who's struggling in the way that you may be struggling. And one of the interesting things that we found is that as the access to home ownership, which of course homes appreciate over time, as that access has dropped and people find themselves unable either to afford or have the credit to be able to afford a home, they tend to invest in things like cars because cars are easier to afford and they also have substantially lower sort of credit hurdles to be able to have access to. But of course, a car doesn't appreciate, it depreciates. And so one of the points that I was trying to make is that as we move in our society toward more inequality, what that does is it makes the challenge of keeping up with the Joneses so much harder in low-income communities. And we see that, right, as preferences for, cars versus homes tends to change. But this isn't about, a set of priorities and people making bad decisions. It's a lot more about our priorities as a society and the opportunities that we empower people to have the kind of security that they deserve. And this epidemic of insecurity that I talk about really is about the fact that we've created a society that is so unequal, and where the public services that we used to be able to rely on and the systems we used to really be able to rely on, whether it's a housing system or a healthcare system or an economic system, that they've failed us largely because they've been strangleholded and chokeholded by a few very large players who tend to exclude too many to create the kind of profit opportunities that they have. And we see this play out in day-to-day and sometimes less than linear or direct ways.
When you talk about people taking care of each other, those kind of things, that this problem of insecurity, you and I both share a family background of faith. So you're Muslim. My family was Catholic. For me, I was raised with the idea of servant leadership, that if you're going to be a leader, any job you ask someone else to do, you would be willing to do yourself. And throughout this book, I noticed something that's different about your progressive message than a lot of other things that I've read, specifically a focus on faith and family. And I don't mean in necessarily the right-wing talking point way, but in a universal way that it seems like the vast majority of Americans could agree with, that frankly looks so much how I grew up. And how does that tie together for you? Because I think that's a different look than a lot of times what I see when it comes to progressive politics, which doesn't talk about faith and family as much.
For me, both faith and family are incredibly important. And one of the things that I've come to appreciate about them both is that, for faith to operate in your life, it has to inspire you to have the humility to recognize that, if you believe in something that's bigger than you, then that means in the sight of that thing, whatever that greater, higher power is, that you and everything else on this earth are equal. And your value here is about the way that you can empower others, especially those who don't have the privileges and opportunities that you have. And, I talk a little bit about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the fact that for him, his entire message was about good character, about the way that you can smile at somebody and you can lift them up, and that you speak to them that empowers them and uplifts them, and recognizes that in the end, your message has to be the way you carry yourself. Because you can't be talking about inequality, you can't be talking about a more kind and uplifting society if you yourself are not kind and uplifting. And so I try my best to embody that in the way that I move in the world. And family is one of those conversations that, when you talk about family values, quote unquote, I talk about this in the book, it is sort of ensconced around this perfect mythical family that sort of exists in this mythos that is also really exclusive of so many of the kinds of families that all of us live in. And the point that I make in the book is that if you believe in family values, then you should be about empowering families to live their best. And that means making sure that they have access to good jobs that pay living wages, make sure that their kids go to great schools, make sure that they can afford a great house, make sure that they have health care if they get sick, make sure that if someone is choosing between caring for a child or working, that choice isn't an impossible one because they can't afford childcare. And that, our seniors, as they age, have access to long-term services and supports so that they can age with dignity. And, to me, it's about building the kind of society that empowers people to have the kinds of family relationships that I think are so nurturing and so important. And so, for me, it's always been about trying to take faith and family, and rather than using them as a cudgel, right, to arrogate oneself over others or to judge others, it is about asking, how do we take the best of faith to uplift all of us? And how do we empower families to live their best lives?
When you talk about empowerment, I think about also the idea that people need to, in a democratic process, grab power for themselves. They need to vote. They need to be active. America does not have the highest voting participation rates. We just did a whole episode about the Michigan primary. We know it won't be necessarily the most listened to part of it, but it's very important because this is crucial, and being participatory is important. You are a figure as a candidate, as a speaker. You get people to move and do things. One of the lines in your book that stuck out to me was, and this is early on in the book, was watching President Obama struggle to advance public policies that often lost much of their bite before they ever got to the negotiation table demonstrated that advancing truth isn't just about discovering and understanding what truth is. It's also about having the will to stand unabashedly for it and against the people and institutions who oppose it. How do we make deep change culturally so that it's more than Twitter and Instagram influencers, and we've got more people running for office, being precinct delegates, doing that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that's a really great point and a great question that arises from that point. Oftentimes, as we watch institutions of power continue to get their way, it can be so disheartening that we lose hope. And I think that more than anything else, one has to approach this work with a belief in one's success over the long term. And even if you're not going to be there to see it, that success will bear out for a generation or generations to come. And toward that end, it's a willingness to, I think, build relationships upon which the kind of outcomes that we want to see can be engaged. The hard part about real movement and movement building is that it does require real relationships, the kind of relationships where, you can get on the phone with someone or look them in the eye and talk about what it is that we want and what we hope for and how we build that. And I recognize that, oftentimes social media is sort of a shortcut for relationships. We think we have a lot of relationships because we have a lot of friends or followers on Facebook or Instagram. That's not the same thing. And I think deep down, it is a requirement to be able to make a commitment to engaging with people at the soul level, right? And actually getting to know them, getting engaged with them, understanding how they think about the world and what we can do to empower each other, and then going forth and continuing to build that kind of movement. And so I just think there has to be a community of people built out of the work that we do to create change. And it's the relationships that I think are going to be so important to protecting that.
In what ways do you think this challenge of coronavirus and, frankly, the mishandling by the federal government, things like that, does that give us an opportunity to look at things different and maybe an impetus to make change?
I think coronavirus has reminded us what really matters most. You think about what this pandemic is taking away from people. It's taking away their lives. It's taking away their livelihoods. But even on a day-to-day level, if you're lucky, it's just taking away relationships that you valued. The ability to go hug your grandma or, meet your baby nephew. And I think it's reminding us that we need each other. And that's what matters here. And so I hope that it shakes us out of the assumption that the systems that we're built out of, the need to provide profits for a very few, will give us the things that we really want. And I hope that in this moment where we may not have ready access to the people that we care about most, it reminds us how much they matter to us and that their well-being matters to us. And that if we were to build a society that empowered them, right, because everybody is somebody's loved one, that empowered them and engaged them at the places that they have pain and frustration and challenge, that if we were able to engage them and think about them and center them in the way that we build our society, then in fact we'd have a far more functional, far more equitable, far more effective society at large. And so I hope that we can continue to center the people who we don't normally think of in the systems that we build as we think about what reform means, right? Our healthcare system shouldn't be thinking about your grandmother as part of a bottom line. They should be thinking about them as your grandmother. And so shouldn't we build a health system that does that? The housing system shouldn't be thinking about, the churn in different demographic housing. It should be asking, how do we provide homes for people, places that they, live and learn and work and play and the hub of their lives. Our economic system shouldn't just be about maximizing profits for a few corporations. It really should be about how do we make sure that everybody can participate and everybody can earn their daily bread and know that they've got a little bit left over after sustaining their needs to be able to enjoy themselves and empower each other. And, if we thought about the humanity at the core of these systems, I think we'd build them very differently. And I hope coronavirus is a moment for us to step back and ask, how far away from that have we gotten and what will it take for us to get there?
Well, Abdul El-Sayed, thank you so much for your time on Daily Detroit today.
It's my privilege. I appreciate you having me, and I hope that I can come back again soon.
Oh, of course, sir. Healing Politics, A Doctor's Journey into the Heart of Our Political Epidemic. I will have links in the show notes. Before we get into the stories, a quick thanks to Carlo, who joined us as a member at patreon.com/Daily Detroit. Our members power thoughtful conversations and local news. And if local stories that we tell matter to you, or we're bringing value to your day and you can swing it, consider joining us. Thank you to Carlo and everyone else. Pontiac-based United Shore, one of the larger mortgage companies in the nation, has been cited by the Oakland County Health Department. County Health Officer Leanne Stafford issued an emergency order Wednesday, noting that the company allegedly has more than 50 cases of coronavirus connected to its headquarters facility. The health department says that United Shore needs to do 4 things: enforce social distancing rules, require face coverings, begin daily illness screenings at the office, and encourage employees to work from home whenever possible. Not complying could be a misdemeanor, punishable by up to 6 months of prison time and $200 a day in fines. It's also a clear sign that Oakland County officials will cite even the largest companies for violating pandemic orders. Numerous sources tell Daily Detroit that the company recently told them that workers could work remotely through the end of the year, but did not mention the health department action. Meanwhile, the other major mortgage player in town, Rocket Companies, which you might know as Quicken Loans, went public today on the New York Stock Exchange. It was hoped by the company that it'd open at $22 a share, but instead it started at $18, taking what was going to be a $3 billion plus deal down to $1.8 billion. Experts say that the issue is Rocket pitched themselves as a technology company with a mortgage platform, but most in the market viewed it as financial services. It also sold 100 million shares when it had planned to sell 150 million. Although we spent an episode on this, we'll note here that how the stock is organized, the company remains under the control of Gilbert and his team, as well as there are clauses explicitly aimed to keep the company in Detroit. The total valuation of the company, as trading opened Thursday, was in the neighborhood of $36 billion. Founder Dan Gilbert was present at the exchange and rang the opening bell this morning. The stock will trade under ticker symbol RKT. And finally, some local coronavirus vaccine news. Henry Ford Health System sends word that a 24-year-old from Taylor named Ashley Wilson became among the first people to potentially get the Moderna mRNA-1273 vaccine. She received it as part of a trial at the health system headquarters in Detroit. I say potential as it's a study where half get a placebo and half get the potential vaccine to help judge its effectiveness. The Moderna vaccine is now in phase 3 trials. It was developed along with the National Institutes of Health and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And that is all for today's show. Thank you so much for supporting and listening to Your Daily Detroit. I'm Jer Stays. Take care of each other, and we'll get through this together. Talk with you tomorrow.